how do you turn 600 pages of your grandfather's notebooks into a novel? Author Stefan Hertmans will join us to talk about his new book, War and Turpentine, one of this year's 10 best books.
I had myself to grow a bit older as a writer in order to be his servant completely and to write a book about the silent tragedies that time can do with people.
What do you do when you've read all of Conrad and Cormac McCarthy? Chances are you'll want to turn to The Northwater. Ian McGuire will tell us about his latest novel, also one of our 10 best books.
What I wanted to do, I suppose partly in Northwater, was to imagine the whaling as less heroic, as much more kind of brutal and bloody than it actually ends up being in large parts of Moby Dick.
Plus, editors here will talk about their favorites among the 10 best and the books that didn't quite make the cut. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Stefan Hertmans joins us now to talk about his new novel, War and Turpentine. Stefan, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
My Flemish is a little rusty. I hope I got the pronunciation there of your last name correct. So this is one of our 10 best books of the year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
For those who have not yet had the pleasure to read it, tell us a little bit about the book.
My book is called War and Turpentine. That's what you call, in literary terms, an oxymoron. It means that those are two things that don't go together, war and turpentine. And I think this, in the first place, attracts people to know what this is about. Of course, it's about one of the wars. And let's say the war that has defined my country, my home country, Belgium, up till today. Till today's politics is defined by what happened in the First World War. And the second war, the turpentine, aims at the ambitions of my grandfather, who was a soldier, even a hero in the trenches in the First World War, and who afterwards became a painter. And those two things have, let's say, stamped my childhood years. I've constantly heard stories about the First World War from first hand from my grandfather. And there was always the smell of turpentine in the house. So there is art, and there is the brutal force of destruction that human beings can do.
Was that the title in the original?
Yes, it's a correct translation of oorlog. Oorlog is war in Dutch, and turpentine, we say.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about your grandfather, Urban Martien.
My grandfather was born at the end of the 19th century, 1891, when Flanders was still extremely poor. You have to imagine my birth city is Ghent. Had the aspect of Liverpool in the 19th century. Charcoal, grey buildings, poverty. It's the years in which socialism, as well as the more Christian charitative movements to help the workers out of their poverty, it's the years in which Europe is running to a catastrophe. It doesn't realize itself what it's going to. It's the years in which Catholicism was still very strong in Flanders. My grandfather was a very pious man. In his memoirs, which he gave me a few months before his death.
This was like 600 pages of notebooks.
Yes, two notebooks, yes, which he has been writing after the death of my grandmother in perfect solitude and serenity, and of which we knew he was writing about it because, as I said, every day he was talking about the war, even 50, 60 years after. Wow. He was completely obsessed by this shocking experiences he had in the trenches, seeing your comrades die, etc. So I thought his notebooks were just about the war, but when I started reading them, I guess almost 200 pages deal with this poverty and this youth. The thing which fascinated me was that those poor people, so to speak, proletarian, were so intellectual in their ways of dealing with the world that in all their modesty, my great-grandfather was a church painter, so he restored frescoes in churches. That's how he met the great love in his life, which was my great-grandmother, who was from a better breed. And it was a marriage out of passion. And what defined the life of those people was, in the first place, dignity in poverty, and the second place, love for art. They could economize for half a year before they could go for once to the opera, for instance. We tend to say that mass culture is opposed to intellectualism, which is now called elitist. But in those days, it wasn't the case. Those people were interested deeply in their heart in what happened in art. So it was really a completely different world, and they were completely different people.
Did your grandfather give the notebooks directly to you personally? And
Yes.
When was that, and why did he choose you?
It was in 1981, a few months before his death. I, at that time, was a hippie with my hair down my shoulders and
He does not look like a hippie now.
wearing jeans. So I was lost for civilization as to him. But still, he gave them to me because he knew I had some aspirations to become a writer. And with the words, whom else should I give them to?
Mm-hmm.
He gave them to me, which is remarkable because the first great gift he gave me when I was 12 years old was the watch he had in his pocket during the war, and which I dropped immediately and which broke, which was my terrible guilt and, let's say, the initial incentive to say I have to repair the guilt of having dropped his time, literally.
Did you start reading them right away?
I waited 30 years.
Why?
I did it intuitively. If you read a book now, you can see this is a book about time. I had myself to grow a bit older as a writer in order to be his servant completely and to write a book about the silent tragedies that time can do with people. I guess intuitively I've shunned away and shied away from it. And I must tell you, I was afraid to read them because he lived in our house because he was very poor. Mm-hmm. The pension of the militaries after the war were scandalously low. So he had to live in the house. So I had the advantage to grow up with 3 generations. So he was a very close friend for me. Mm-hmm. So this meant it was very emotional. And I always thought, I've been teaching for 40 years and I didn't have the time to write such a book. I could write all my other books and my novels and essays.
You've written plays and poetry.
Exactly. I've done a lot of things. But this, it was too deep and I was afraid of it. And I must tell you, a week after I quit teaching at the Academy of Fine Arts at college where I was. A week later, I was reading his memoirs, and of course, this was terribly emotional to me.
Now, he had been a big storyteller. As you said, he never stopped talking about the war, but had he also talked about his childhood, or was that part new to you?
No, he didn't talk much about that, and certainly not about the great passion of his life, which I reveal at the end of the book.
We won't reveal it here.
No, what he was telling us time and time again was, the Germans were behind a maize field and we were the first to shoot and I lost 3 men, etc. So he was telling the things which had been exhilarating to him. But let's say that the things that really meant the hell of the war to him, he didn't tell us. He wrote them down.
Do you think he intended for you then to do something with these notebooks, to either write about them or publish them? Or
this is a question I've been putting myself over and over again. Why did he write them? Did he write them to be known one day? I don't know, because he was so modest. Just to give you one example, a few years before his death, the king gave him nobility. Mm-hmm. He became a nobleman, in fact. He got the message, he shoved it again in the brown envelope and hid it on the attic behind the children's toys. So he didn't want people to know. So it must have been very ambivalent for him.
But presumably the rest of the family did know about it.
We knew about it, of course.
And what did you all think about the fact that he had done this and didn't want to be recognized?
We understood it because we are also acquainted with Freudian language. We can say traumatized and frustrated. Mm-hmm. He didn't have that vocabulary. So he wasn't only modest, there was no other way for those people to go through all that. And it was a real trauma. If you imagine that he started writing his memoirs 50 years after the war. And there's not one word he has, how do you say
crossed out?
Yeah, crossed out. So
it's very intentional.
This is typically traumatic. This is traumatizing. That's a trauma talking. If somebody can write 50 years after an experience without crossing out one word, this is terrible. Mm-hmm. So this testimony of his was so, multi-layered that it took me a while before I found the right form to write it. I started writing a classical biography about him. I tried to type out his memoirs. But you should know that Dutch is evolving very quickly. And
What's the language?
yes, the language is, his language was so archaic, so to speak, so I couldn't present it to the contemporary reader. So I had to work it out. And before I found the right form to do that, it had taken me 3 years of trying things out.
And when did you decide, okay, I'm just going to fictionalize it?
From the moment I knew I couldn't just type it out, I thought it's my responsibility. So then I started writing a beautiful birth scene of 9 pages, a terrible birth scene in poverty in Flanders, 19th century. I wrote down the scenes. Some of them are still in the book, about the boy of 6 who was begging for charcoal at the locomotive so that his mother could cook in the evening. At a certain moment I thought, my God, if I don't take care, this will be Dickens in Flanders. So I have to rework it again. I wanted to find a really contemporary form to tell this story. That means to bring myself in as a narrator, but also as a character in the book. Finally, I got this idea of structuring the book as a triptych. It's something like a saint's life, of course, with some irony. It's the saint in his boyhood days, the saint as a soldier in the war, and the saint as an old man thinking about his great love. Mm-hmm. So when I saw this Catholic triptych thing, so to speak, I found the right form to write about it. But of course, in the second part about the war, it's he talking. Mm-hmm. And there I almost literally follow him from page to page, because all those scenes of the war are so terrible.
Was it a difficult book for you to write?
It was one of the most difficult books I've ever written in my life, absolutely. Because there was emotionally so much in it. It's also some sort of autobiography.
Yeah.
It's the man who had an enormous influence on me. It's he who taught me art. It's he who taught me, as his father did, to watch a painting of Tintoretto and then look at nature again and say, do you see the difference of colors? Why did Tintoretto do that? That's enormous. And he was a simple man. He was not a man with an education. He was just a man with a great talent.
Did you know, you include images in the book, did you know that that had to be part of it?
No, this grows. That's the growing process. Mm-hmm. I don't believe too much in inspiration that comes before the writing. Inspiration comes with the writing.
So this is your first novel to come out in English in America. What's the experience been like for you so far of reaching this readership?
It's been very interesting to compare how the reactions were in the UK and here. In the UK, of course, British still have that obsession with the First World War.
Right.
They lost so many people there in the Flemish trenches that in the first place it has been recognized as a great book on war, as it was in Germany, for instance, and in Italy. But what happened in America is that I see that people who are not acquainted personally with this war, as we were, it were our grandfathers, that the book has been estimated more for its literary qualities. And that was to me very, very agreeable, very nice. Yeah.
There have been comparisons to W.G. Sebald. How does that strike you?
It was for me something very important, because Sebald has really been a master for me. Mm-hmm. I've been reading him from his first books 20 years ago. We were almost personally in contact with him. My wife was for 15 years the director of a very important literature house in Brussels. And we were phoning with him, and he had promised to come to Brussels, and a week later he was dead. Mm. So there's even this tragical bound with this man, with this brilliant writer. And some people, it may sound amazing or astonishing, but I think he has been as important as Nabokov for literature in a completely different way, because he showed us how you can combine autobiographical layers in a book, non-fiction and fiction, and how you can make that into a fresco about what happened in the past and how you should deal with the past. We cannot really feel what people felt 100 years ago. We're different people. We're spoiled. We haven't known a war, and so on. But in this historical tenderness, so to speak, you can try to understand something of which you know you will never entirely understand. And this respect consists mainly in the fact that you know you will never entirely understand. If you make a simplistic historical novel, I put you in a bubble and say, okay, it's the time of Caesar. Here we are. It's the Roman time. If you really have respect for the distance, you go in and out of the story. You say, I think that can have happened. I'm not sure, of course, but I think they must have felt like this or that. So this conjecture, this constantly trying to approach something which you cannot entirely approach. I think the genius of Sibbald has taught us this.
Well, our naming this one of our 10 best books means that, at least in our view, and we think in many readers, you've come very close, if not entirely, achieving that. So
Thank you.
Congratulations
Thank
again. The book is called War and Turpentine by Stefan Hertmans, and it is one of our 10 best books of the year. Stefan, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Alexander Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. Hi, Alexander.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, you have 3 really weird book stories to tell us. Let's start with the bad little children's books.
Yes. So this is the latest controversial book that was pulled by a publisher. It's a parody book called The Bad Little Children's Book, and it looks kind of like one of those lovely 1950s kind of little golden books, but it's all full of pretty offensive racial stereotypes. There's one book cover that says the bad Asian driver, and you see them going off the top of a building. There's several sort of poorly crafted visual jokes about Muslims and terrorism.
This is like a what were they thinking book.
This is a what were they thinking book. I mean, the outrage was so predictable and swift that it's almost like, how did it even get into circulation and how did it get published in the first place? But of course, the statements that came out from Abrams initially, they said, we stand behind the author, we stand behind the book. This is a parody. It's clearly intended as parody. We're not propagating these racist ideas. We're poking fun at them. But the author himself finally said, I've gotten so much criticism. People are misinterpreting this. I want to withdraw it. So
who's the author?
The author is Arthur Gackley, and he has written other parody books, and he finally said, this is being misinterpreted. We should stop publishing it. So they're not actually recalling it or pulping it or anything, but they're not going to print anymore. And the announced first printing was 30,000 copies. So it's not a small operation. So that was one little controversy. An even stranger one, I thought, was the Hatchimals controversy of 2016. For our listeners who don't have small children demanding these things, these are like the it toy of this year.
They're not cheap.
They are not cheap. They are almost $60. They're already, of course, sold out, and people are price gouging each other online to get them. One of the people who came under fire for doing just that was the best-selling author Sarah Gruen. She wrote the novel Water for Elephants, and she bought 156 of these toys on Black Friday online and planned to mark them up and sell them. She spent $23,000 on her little load of Hatchimals.
Now she's stuck with them.
And, well, she went onto eBay to sell them, and they wouldn't let her resell them in bulk. So she put up this sort of Facebook post pleading with her fans and readers to please come and buy her Hatchimals. And for a good reason. She's raising money, apparently, for the legal defense of a man who she believes is wrongfully convicted and is in prison. And she's working on a documentary about this person. But of course, with feelings being so high about Hatchimals, people reacted strongly. Some people accused her of Christmas greed and, quote, exploiting families whose children want these toys for Christmas is awful, another person wrote on Facebook. It's funny to go to her Facebook page, though, because you can clearly see a lot of people saying, I'm going to send you a private message. They're bidding on these Hatchimals. So I think she'll move them pretty quickly. It was an interesting picture of both capitalism at work and philanthropy. And, a lot of people said, you're a best-selling author. You have a platform. Why not just actually start a nonprofit for this guy? Why use Hatchimals?
Right. Moral of the story, don't mess with the Hatchimals.
Definitely. And don't get between demanding parents and their Hatchimals.
Our last story is weird but happy.
Weird and very happy. This fall, there have been so many best-selling cookbooks by the usual suspects, Ina Garten and other chefs, Anthony Bourdain. But the one that nobody sort of expected to take off in the way that it has is this opulent cookbook by Salvador Dali that Taschen republished. It was out of print for 40 years.
This is the painter, Salvador Dali.
This is the surrealist
not
painter.
The chef.
Not the famous, Spanish chef who doesn't exist, but the surrealist painter, Salvador Dali, had created this cookbook in the 70s. And so Taschen has re-released it in this beautifully sort of constructed with gorgeous illustrations cookbook for $60, and in its first week, it sold more than 4,000 copies. That's according to Nielsen. So that's making it one of the top-selling holiday books so far. And just in case people are curious what kind of food Salvador Dali was interested in. There is oxtail, calf's brains with bacon, lamb's head, frog pasties, I think, not pastries. So there's also
appropriately surreal.
Very surreal. There's also a recipe that calls for live eels. So you need those on hand if you want to cook anything from them. But you might just look at the pictures, which are pretty cool.
Say, I hope the illustrations are nice. All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
Here to join us to talk about the 10 best books of the year, we have editors from the Book Review, Jennifer Salai, Greg Coles, and Elida Becker. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. So I'm going to ask each of you to talk about one book from the 10 best that was a particular favorite, and then we'll do something even more exciting, which is to talk about the book that you wish had made the list but didn't ultimately get in the final 10. So let's start. Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about one of your favorite books on our 10
Sure.
best?
I'm actually going to do something a little unexpected. I mostly assign fiction at the Book Review, and I do love this year's fiction picks in the 10 best. But I'm going to go for a nonfiction book, which is not one that I assigned, but it's a book that I have been recommending and kind of pushing into people's hands all year. I talked about it when I did a Facebook Live event for the Book Review earlier this year. I think I've talked about it on the podcast while I was reading it. And that book is Hisham Mattar's The Return. It's a memoir by a guy whose father was a Libyan dissident, first a Libyan diplomat, and then as Gaddafi kind of consolidated power and became more of a dictator, the father started protesting him and was kidnapped off the streets of London and returned to Libya, where he was thrown into prison. He sneaked letters out of prison to the family for a number of years and then suddenly went silent in the mid-90s. Hisham Mattar is a novelist who has, after the fall of Gaddafi during the Obama administration, he returned to Libya, hence The Return.
In many ways.
Exactly. It's a book about exile. It's a book about art, and he looks specifically at other writers who have fraught connection to a missing homeland, some who returned, some who never returned, and how it's impacted their writing. But really, it's a very much a father-son story and a story about this missing father. It's very powerful, moving, smart and well written. I've never read Mattar's novels, and I'm eager to go back and track those down now.
All right. Elida, you're going to talk about a novel that touches on some of the similar themes.
Exactly. It's a grandfather in this case, and a writer who had kept all of these papers that his grandfather had written and not paid very much attention to, and then suddenly realized that the anniversaries of World War I were coming up, and he really ought to open them up. And what he found was quite remarkable. It's War in Turpentine by Stefan Hertmans.
Who was on the podcast earlier.
Anyway, I think I'm among the editors at the Book Review the most fond of historical fiction. And yet, you come to a book about World War I and you think, oh, my God, what angle can we take that is new? This book reminds you that no matter how many times you look at this experience, it is always new. And the memoir at the center of it, of his grandfather, just an ordinary man in the trenches in World War I, is quite moving and elegant in a strange way, even though it's quite horrific at the same time.
One of the things that Hertmans said when he was on the podcast earlier is that he organized the book like a triptych. Mm-hmm. And that his father was raised Catholic. The Catholic Church was still very strong at that time, and that a little bit ironically, it's sort of like a life of a saint.
Exactly, and the two framing narratives are his own explorations and revisitings of the places where his grandfather lived, and it's interesting because the grandfather, there's a history of religious painting in the family. They decorated churches, and so that triptych is quite important as a framing mechanism.
And Jen, going to nonfiction now.
I thought that this was a really great list this year, and the nonfiction list especially, I thought, was really quite impressive. One of the books that I was really taken by is a book by Matthew Desmond, who's a sociologist. He now teaches at Harvard, and his book is called Evicted. And it did get quite a bit of attention when it was first published earlier this year. Part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the book is really just so capacious in terms of what it covers. So he basically embedded himself for more than a year in Milwaukee. At first he lived for about 5 months at a trailer park, and then 8 or 9 months, I think, in a rooming house on Milwaukee's north side, where the poverty rate is very high. He spent a lot of time getting to know not only families who are on the brink of eviction, and so these are families where 70 to 80% of their income is spent on rent, which is just extraordinarily high.
Yeah.
And so he spent time with these families, getting to know them, but he also spent time with the landlords as well and the lawyers, and getting to know how eviction functions as a system in this city, which he also makes the case that this city in a way is representative of other cities in America in terms of how poverty and housing and power intersect. He shows how eviction really can become a vicious cycle, and so once the cascade of eviction proceedings begins and a family is eventually evicted, it makes everything else in their life just harder to sustain. So in that sense, in the end, he compares it in a way to mass incarceration as something that really follows these people wherever they go, no matter how they try to get out of the system. It becomes something that basically characterizes their experience, and it's just really hard to break out of.
That's one of those books that I feel like it's on the 10 best because it had an impact. It should continue to have an impact.
Exactly. And I should also say, though, that Desmond is a really excellent writer.
It's very well written. He's a great storyteller, too. It is capacious, but it's
yes.
also very granular. He gives you these people's lives.
Right. I mean, there's a way in which it does read. These are real stories and these are real people, but there's a way in which he really, there's almost a novelist's sensibility in terms of how he really tries to understand everybody's motivations and doesn't try to simplify them.
I'm going to note that when you started your this conversation, you said that you were very happy with the nonfiction side. But on the fiction side, there was one book that you wish had made the list.
That's true. I really was hoping to see Zadie Smith's Swing Time on the list. And I know that it's a book that has divided editors and critics. But I myself was really just impressed with, I think, what she accomplished, but also just in terms of following her work over the past. I mean, she's still quite young, but she's been writing, I think, White Teeth came out when she was 24, so it's been more than a decade now. And just watching her development as a novelist, I think, has been really impressive. And that book I found just incredibly moving in terms of how it sort of captured this friendship between these two girls, and also their different upbringings and issues of class and race. But also I thought that she got at some, the book is told from the first person, and she got at some really sort of interesting notions of subjectivity in the novel, which I felt like I just found it to be a very moving experience reading the whole thing, and not just the story about the two girls.
That's
Even the
fair.
story about Amy.
You say that was a divisive novel. I think maybe less divisive than you think. Nobody that I know who's read it has not enjoyed it. It was just a question of whether it rose to one of the top 5 of the year. I think if we were
The bar is so high for Zadie.
I think if we were allowed to pick 10 best novels of the year instead of just 5, then Swing Time might well have been on it. There were parts of that novel that were as good or better as anything that she's ever done.
Both On Beauty and NW made our 10 best.
That's right. This book revisits some of the stuff she's done throughout her career,
Right.
certainly. and again, does it as well as she has ever done that.
Did it make a difference for you that this was in the first person?
I mean, it made a difference in terms of the reading experience. I mean, I just think when you filter something through the first person in that way, with a particular kind of narrator who, you know, she's unnamed, she very much lives her life in the service of this pop star. I was impressed with what she did with it. Greg, you look circumspect.
Well, I'm just thinking for this stuff, the friendship between girls, the stuff set in Northwest London, her writing about that material has always had an immediacy, that even in the third person. So I don't think that we gained much in terms of that in going to the first person. It's not that suddenly I feel I have more access to Zadie Smith than I did in the earlier books.
Alida, what book do you wish had made it to the top 10?
Well, My Name is Lucy Barton is a small book, but I think one with so many different layers, and it's a very quiet book. Elizabeth Stroud is writing about a relationship between a mother and a daughter, and it all mainly takes place in one hospital room in New York, but it spreads out. It has, I mean, I come from a Midwestern family where you don't talk about your emotions, and this is also a novel about a generation and a change in class and status and how you deal with that, and how you sort of sneak under these preventive things that have kept you from one another. And I think it may have suffered from having been published in the spring, and, you know, everyone waits for the big fall books. But I think it's very much worth going back to and reading again.
And Elizabeth has another novel coming out again in the spring, this in 2017. So hopefully that won't happen.
Hopefully that
All right, yeah. Greg, what do you wish had made it to the top 10?
A book that I really loved this year was Don DeLillo's Zero K. I'm a big DeLillo fan anyway. It's a book that is, you were talking about a triptych before. This is kind of a diptych. The first part is set in Uzbekistan or somewhere in Eastern Europe. Yes. It's very science fiction-y. It's about cryogenics, and it's a billionaire developing a laboratory to try to preserve life as long as possible, specifically because his wife, the love of his life, is dying, and he is trying to fight death through science. A fairly familiar idea and not the strongest thing about the book. But then in the second half of the book, it shifts to his son's perspective and his son's life in New York City. And it gets into global politics, but also just the kind of finely detailed day-to-day existence that was what I thought DeLillo did so well in Underworld and has done intermittently well throughout his career. He's, I think, undervalued at... he's such a big ideas writer, a big picture writer. I think that people overlook kind of the brilliant, kind of mundane stuff that he does. And, you know, he's just a great writer of sentences.
And we overlooked him in the top 10. All right. Jen, Greg, Alida, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Ian McGuire joins us now. His new book is The North Water, one of our 10 best books of the year. Ian, thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And you are not in Manchester, but actually in Texas right now. What are you doing in Texas?
Yeah, I'm teaching in the creative writing program at University of North Texas, which is just in Denton, which is just outside Dallas. So, I taught at Manchester for a long time, but I fancied a change, so I'm here for a while.
All right. Well, you're a long way from Manchester.
Yes.
For those who have not yet had the pleasure of reading The North Water, tell us a little bit about the story. Set the scene for us. It opens very dramatically.
Yes, it opens in Hull, which is the town where I grew up, actually. It opens in the mid-19th century. It tells a story of a man named Henry Drax, who we very quickly learn is a violent murderer, and he's also a harpooner on a whale ship called the Volunteer. So most of the novel takes place on the Volunteer while it's making a voyage up towards the Arctic Circle to hunt for whales, and it tells the story of Drax, and also another man, Patrick Sumner, who's the ship's surgeon, who becomes the person who attempts to resist and fight back against what Drax is doing.
When you were conceiving this book, I mean, did you think, like, what I want to write is a book about whaling, or what I want to write about is this villainous character, Henry Drax? Or how did the idea evolve?
Yeah, I mean, the idea came in a few strange stages, actually. This novel came out of my attempt to write a different novel, which was a biographical novel about Herman Melville.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of struggled with that for a while, and then when I got to the part of the novel where I was doing research on Melville's whaling days, I stumbled across a diary that was written by Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes author,
Mm-hmm.
when he was a surgeon on a whaling ship in the mid-19th century. So that gave me an idea of writing a novel about a murderer on an Arctic whaling ship. And that's where the North Water came from.
I had to assume that you were a fan of Melville and also of Conrad. Their influences are quite clear here. Had you always wanted to write a book about the sea?
No, not really about the sea, but Melville, yeah. Melville's been a big sort of influence of mine for many years. So I've always been interested in him as a writer, and, yeah, biographically, and the kind of ups and downs of his career. And whaling, of course, is a fascinating subject, and you can't write about whaling without having Melville kind of peering over your shoulder as you do so.
What is it that specifically drew you to Melville?
I think what Melville does with whaling is to turn it into a kind of metaphor for all kinds of sort of metaphysical and philosophical issues. And I think he draws out of this sort of very barbaric industry a very kind of rich sort of thematic element. And I try to borrow a little bit of that for my book, although I handle things quite differently in some ways as well.
How did you consciously want the book to be different from a Melville novel?
Yeah, well, I mean, Melville takes up whaling and he manages to turn it into partly a kind of heroic enterprise in that Ahab becomes a kind of tragic figure. But he also, as I said, manages to turn it into this philosophical exploration, so finding new ways of turning whaling into a kind of philosophical metaphor for the human condition. So what I wanted to do, I suppose partly in North Water, was push back against those things a little bit and to imagine the whaling as less heroic and less metaphysical and as much more kind of brutal and bloody and much more material than it actually ends up being in large parts of Moby Dick.
Listeners who have not read the book should know that unlike Moby Dick, which is, as we know, a long book with some, shall we say, slower passages, you wrote this really as, a thriller and quite tight.
That was kind of deliberate in some ways. I enjoy books to have a strong plot, and I wanted right from the beginning for the North Water to sort of move quickly and to be gripping, as well as to have interesting characters and to be well written and to have a kind of thematic richness. But yeah, the sense that this book has a gripping plot and keeps you going was something that I wanted to be in there from the very beginning.
One of the things it does so successfully, too, is that there are a number of surprise or twists and turns, but they're not like the obvious surprise twists and turns. Like they really are surprising, and they don't feel manipulative. They feel like kind of lifelike, Well, of course, you thought that this was going to happen, but then this thing happened instead.
I mean, that's what I tell my students when I talk about plotting in a creative writing class, that what you're aiming for is something which is surprising, but then also the reader thinks it's absolutely predictable in some sense as well. So you're going for some combination of complete surprise and complete plausibility. So the closer you can get to that, the better, I think.
That is great advice. And it's funny because I always want to ask this of people who teach writing as well as practice it. And you are, before teaching in Texas, the founder and director of the University of Manchester Center for New Writing. I am curious, what advice do you give to students that you don't necessarily follow yourself and maybe that you didn't follow in this book?
Well, I think sometimes, there's old pieces of advice like you should write every day, which I don't do. I guess write what you know. I don't do that either. The classic piece of creative writing advice, which I think is sort of a bad piece of advice, is show, don't tell, which is all about, you should just be wary of sort of explaining things or spelling things out for the reader. So I think there are plenty of sort of cliches of creative writing which can be swept aside, really.
You start off the book not with your flawed hero, but with your very, very nasty villain, Henry Drax. Where did he come from?
I guess the center of Drax for me is this idea of animality, really. That's what I kept on coming back to when I was trying to figure out what he would do in certain circumstances and what motivates him. So he really is like an animal in lots of ways. He lives in the present moment. He has no concern about the future or the past. He's just really interested in fulfilling certain desires and instincts. That is what contrasts him with Patrick Sumner, as you say, the flawed hero, because Sumner is someone who can't shake off the past, that he's debilitated by what's happened to him, and he can't seem to move forward. So that was the kind of contrast which I was thinking with that Drax is this animalistic person who lives in the present moment, and Sumner is a man who is sunk in his own history.
And they come into conflict.
Yes.
One of the things I love too is that the way you have Drax, he has a worldview, even though, as you said, he's sort of like this animalistic present moment, but you allow him to articulate his sort of approach to life.
Yes, and it's I suppose it's what you might call an extreme sort of moral relativism. He thinks that right and wrong is just what people have the power to say what is right and wrong.
We won't draw any obvious political parallels.
Yeah, he's kind of a post-truth person in some sense. Philosophically, it goes back to kind of someone like Nietzsche or someone like that. It's all about power. The powerful get to define what's true and get to define what's right. So there is something present day about his what is a kind of nihilistic attitude in lots of ways.
I don't want to reveal any spoilers, and certainly not the ending for our listeners, but I'm curious if you knew when you began this book where it was going to go and how it was going to end, because I certainly didn't as a reader.
No, I didn't. I mean, I always have plans. As a writer, I'm a writer who likes to sort of plan things out, but then all the plans usually change. So I had a vague idea, but the actual ending was very different from what I initially thought it would be. And I rewrote it several times. So it kind of surprised me in the end, which I think is not a bad thing. If it sort of surprises you as an author, then maybe it's a pleasant surprise for the reader as well. And there are also aspects of the very end which I'm kind of, again, I can't really talk about without being a spoiler, but I've talked to readers about the ending, and people read it in slightly different ways, even from what I intended, which is interesting.
That's always a good thing, I think.
Yes, yeah.
All right. I will leave it to listeners and hopefully future readers to discover a book that, for all its sort of harrowing bloodiness, is a huge amount of fun, too. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Pamela.
Ian McGuire is the author of The North Water, one of our 10 best books of the year. Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, Greg.
Well, John last week talked about a novel that he just read called Schlump. And in a kind of spasm of free association, it led me to order Evelyn Waugh's great 1938 novel, Scoop.
I've always wanted to read that. Is it so great?
So have I, and I have never read it. I've spent the last week kind of more reading about it than actually reading it. I've been kind of setting myself up to read it. I mean, Evelyn Waugh, of course, great comic British novelist. And what's amazing is how relevant Scoop still seems to be today, not least because it's about a schlumpy journalist named William Booth, who is mistaken for a distant cousin who's a great novelist, a great middlebrow novelist, John Courtney Booth, and is sent off on assignment to cover a war in the fictional Ishmaelia, I think is the name of the country where he's covering this promising little war, as his editor puts it. The newspaper that sends him there is called The Daily Beast, which of course now is the website, The Daily Beast, that Tina Brown started back in 2008.
Is that where she took it from?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Obviously. Yeah.
So that's maybe the most familiar referent to this book now. The whole vibe and milieu of the literary world that it relates still feels very relevant to the literary world today. I'll read you just the opening paragraph of Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. While still a young man, John Courtney Booth had, as his publisher proclaimed, achieved an assured and enviable position in contemporary letters. His novels sold 15,000 copies in their first year and were read by the people whose opinion John Booth respected. Between novels, he kept his name sweet in intellectual circles with unprofitable but modish works on history and travel. His signed first editions sometimes changed hands at a shilling or two above their original price. And it goes on from there.
Very nice.
It's always been hard for mid-level novels.
All right. Before turning to you, John, a quick thank you for hosting last week.
Of course, you sound perfectly fine again. I'm glad.
I'm going for like an Emma Stone, Jean Moreau kind of thing, as opposed to the dying seal sound of last week. But what are you reading?
I am reading the new book by Michael Lewis, which I'm sure everyone has heard about, called The Undoing Project. He's
who's he? Just kidding.
He's a notable journalist. No, he's actually, Michael Lewis, I think, is one of those people, and they're very rare, who get a ton of attention and everyone talks about every time they have a book, and it's completely deserved. I just think that he's a genius on some level. And this book is about Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman himself had a book a few years ago called Thinking Fast and Slow, which was on our 10 best books of the year list that year, which I'm also sort of dipping into. But Lewis really tells the story of their friendship and how they sort of counterintuitively demolished a lot of thinking about economics, and basically that, the rational actor that economics was built on for a long time. They basically said people don't act rationally nearly as often as you think, and in fact often act completely differently in the exact same situation if you just describe it to them differently. They'll make one decision one day and the other the next. It's also a very moving story about, two very brainy guys who were very different in many ways, but who became, close through their work. Tversky died several years ago, but Kahneman is still very much around. And he's very good at painting their different personalities. Amos, he calls them Amos and Danny throughout the book instead of referring to them by their last names, so you really feel like you get to know them. And, Amos is very charismatic and lively and can be the life of a party, and Danny's a bit more socially awkward. They're both obviously brilliant people. Amos's mind works a little bit more logically and coherently, and he's the one, I think, who kind of put together a lot of the argumentation of it. He's got this great line, actually, that I'll find it, where he talks about the setup between them and the different work they do. And he says, the economist's view of the collaboration was that Amos Tversky had set out, like an anthropologist, to study an alien tribe of beings less rational than himself, and his tribe was Danny. So Danny sort of, provided a lot of the fodder, and then they together synthesized it. Lewis is so lucid and such a great storyteller, so the book itself is a pleasure to read, but the ideas in the book are kind of making my head explode because it really touches on every possible element of human nature and decision-making. I would never assume people are rational. That's insane to me. And so they're basically disproving that. But in order to disprove it and be taken seriously, they're asked to sort of make a theory about it that is somewhat mathematical and structural. So you're basically trying to make a rational model of people's irrationality. And so it's a bit confusing.
Did I read somewhere, does this book stem from an earlier Michael Lewis book? Did Amos provide the ideas behind Moneyball?
Well, it's funny because the first chapter of this book is really all about this basketball executive, and it almost feels like it's just going to be the basketball sequel to Moneyball about baseball and The Blind Side, which was about football, and then it kind of swerves directly into the sociology. It's not that they were behind Moneyball, it's just that their ideas are sort of the foundation of all kinds of counterintuitive thinking that happens now in society, including like the way that Atul Gawande would write about, doctors trying to lessen human error in surgery and things like that. All of that kind of stems from the way that they said, we have to look at the practices we're doing and we have to examine them and not take so much for granted. And so Michael Lewis said that he read a review of Moneyball in the New Republic, and he had never heard of these guys. And the reviewers said, this is a great book, but the one thing he doesn't acknowledge is that the kind of philosophical debt is to these guys.
I hear all this, and the main question I have is, why aren't people named Amos anymore?
It's a great name.
Such a good name.
It is, Amos and Danny. What about you, Pamela? What are you reading this week?
I just finished a book this morning, and so I feel like this sense of completion, and now, of course, the frantic, now what? So the book I finished was Maria Semple's Today Will Be Different. And she's just has such a good comic voice that if I were to read a passage aloud, as you two have both done, it would just have to be something funny and silly, but also sharply observant. And the one thing, since I don't have the book right in front of me, that I can remember is something. It's one of those lines that you read and you're like, oh, this. I feel like this is a joke that everyone's already heard, but I haven't heard it. And it's so cute that it feels like I should have. The main character screws up in one way or another, which he does throughout the book. And the person, the character she's talking to just says, "Pobody's nerfect." I'm like, have you already heard that?
No.
Am I the only one who hasn't heard that?
I haven't heard it, but now I'm going to be using it a lot.
That's right. The whole book is filled with things that you're like, I'm just going to lift that, and I'm not going to attribute. I'm just going to take it, and people are going to be like, how did you get to be so witty? All right. Thanks, John. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.